Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest webinar from Omdia. Today's topic is navigating the complexities of modern backups, cyber protection, effective management, and hybrid IT strategies. Our webinar is co-presented by Omdia and our partner, OpenText. My name is Alan Tatara, and I will be your moderator today, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. All right, before we get started, let me just cover a few housekeeping items. So at the bottom of your audience console, you're going to see a number of application widgets that you can use. So make sure you check out all of these during the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and other valuable resources are available in the download in the resource list widget. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit these through the Q&A widget that is located on the left side of your screen. Now, all questions will be captured, so if we don't get a chance to answer you, we will follow up via email. An on-demand version of this webinar will be made available in approximately 24 hours and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. And finally, if you have any technical difficulties, just click on that help widget and you will find answers to some of the common questions. All right, so let's get on with our presentation. So let me introduce to you our speaker today. I am joined by Dennis Hahn. Dennis is a senior analyst of data center storage at Omdia. Welcome, Dennis. Great to have you with us today. So let me now turn it over to you so we can get started with our presentation.
Thank you, Alan. As Alan said, this is Dennis Hahn, and we're going to go through and start talking about backup and kind of what's been changing and some of the complexities and what's happening in modern backup. So I kind of broke it down into three basic areas I wanted to cover. Backup covers more than this, more than we can cover in an hour. But the three big active areas I can see right now are the areas of cyber protection around, ransomware has had a huge impact on the marketplace, trying to protect against ransomware. Backup is key in the protection area of ransomware, right? So it's a very important area, and it continues to evolve as to how better to use backup to protect there. Effective management. Here, basically, I'm trying to suggest that backups have really evolved. When I look at, even 5 years ago and look at the applications and how they're managed, and that they're really becoming more and more, there's a march towards self-management, or a really big word, autonomous, almost backups. There's a real shortage of skills in the marketplace today, and so applications need to become smarter. And so we're going to talk about some of the ways they're becoming smarter in this evolution towards more effective management, or really maybe the ultimate thing of almost self-management. And then hybrid IT strategies. Cloud has become a huge component of everything we do as well. Data has to be protected in the cloud. Cloud can also be a partner and a place where when you integrate with backups, can make your backups much more powerful. So we're going to talk about all those today. So first off, ransomware. Ransomware, it's a persistent threat. It's obviously not going away. In a recent survey, ransomware always ranks up really high in our surveys, and it was 42% the respondents said they were kind of affected by ransomware attacks. That's almost as large as like the digital transformation, and very similar to the skill shortages, which we know they're very severe as well. So ransomware is a big deal. It's a very challenging aspect of managing IT today, and one that if an attack breaks through, potentially lose a lot of data. You potentially could ruin the company, certainly ruin your job. So it's something to really keep an eye on. When we start looking at what can backup do in the area of ransomware, a lot of the ransomware, the discussion is around kind of network security and things like that. But for ransomware, it can look through the data it's collected and try to figure out if there's been a sleeping attack in that data, so that when a recovery occurs, you'll recover back some ransomware attacked, data images. That's not a good thing. So to be able to actually sort through the data you've backed up and see if there's any kind of malicious activity, ransomware within it, is really important. Obviously, creating a backup itself is key. If you look at all the NIST stuff, is key to one of the aspects of protecting against ransomware. But it's not just creating the backups. The backups are kind of a bit of an insurance plan, but really the goal anymore has got to be recovery. It's like the backup supports the recovery. And so these ransomware recovery workflows are just so important. And we'll talk more about that. Ransomware, though, it's, part of really this overall comprehensive kind of protection that backups do around, data loss and disasters and other things. The one thing that's complicating everything that we'll talk a lot more about is that data is residing in a lot of different places anymore, in the cloud, on edge sites, and on premise as well, and even various aspects of the cloud, like software as a service as opposed to infrastructure as a service. All those need to be covered now because our data is living a lot of different places than it used to in the past, right? It used to be kind of just stuck within a single data center. One of the other surveys we recently did at Omdia was, we did ask people, how confident were they about their organization's plans for responding to a ransomware attack? And the good news is that everyone knows they need to respond now. It's pretty important, but still, a lot of people, 53%, said somewhat confident. Somewhat confident probably isn't good enough. It wouldn't be good enough for my data. It's not often still. So a few years ago, people didn't even consider making how the backup and copy should be made to protect against ransomware. I think we're past that point now. Everyone realizes you have to make the copies, but really the goal here is the recovery, right? So, how do you recover better, quicker, and make sure you have high confidence? You need to move yourself into that very high confidence area because sooner or later, there's probably going to be a breakthrough attack the way things are going. So if you think about that, recovery, the process is key. You don't want to be recovering in 6 months or 8 months. The last couple customers or clients I've talked to, they're in that area. It's like, that's just way too long. You have to start with the recovery and understand what kinds of copies you need to give you a better recovery. So you need a backup plan around recovery. You also should probably, to make it a lot easier, look for softwares and such that give you the same experience for recovery everywhere. Different backups, different applications back up differently, and we'll talk more about that. But it's important to kind of be able to cookie cutter this so you can quickly bring things back. And also have a contingency plan in place as well. So, when your recoveries kind of fail, then how are you going to get your data back? If you can't get it back the way you intended, what's your plan B here? Make sure you have that in place. So, when you start looking at the software themselves, the backup applications themselves, look for web-based approaches to recovery. Look for streamline workflows that are cookie cutter, workflows that are quick and easy, workflows that kind of are the same everywhere. You might want to do it at a file level. You might want to do it at a image level. Whatever works for you is fine, just as long as it works. Make sure they're consistent. It probably, to move yourself from the somewhat confident to the very confident, you probably need to practice a little bit and do some recovery drills and make sure that you can actually do this thing. A lot of the backup vendors also have, and so you want to make sure your backup vendor supports these recovery drills. One of the ways that they seem to be able to do this many times is actually create a sandbox where you can recover the data images into the sandbox, ensure that there's no ransomware that'll reinfect everything else that you're working on, and then release it and make it for use. But again, that takes software, that takes process. The other thing to consider is it used to be protected, make sure you have and backups are made to protect your primary data, right? So they're protecting your primary data, the secondary copy. But if you're a malicious actor, what a better place to attack the data than attack the backup instead of the primary. If the primary is well protected, and increasingly, cyber protections and security, that's tends to still be the focus. Go to the backups, go get the backups, turn the backups off, steal the data out of the backups. Data theft's becoming a bigger issue as well. So make sure, all that's covered. But, so in the backup sense, you need to protect your data from not only being encrypted and held by ransom, but also from being stolen. That's especially if you're like in the healthcare areas or in government. Uh, the attackers just love to steal government data and publish it out if you don't pay the ransom. So you also have to protect the backup application data themselves so they can't get at that. And you can see the response, or the last questionnaire we had, which data security related issue have you encountered? Well, ransomware is big, data destruction is big, but theft of information is 42%, 41% as well. So that's theft, especially for some industries, is a really, really big deal. It's probably a big deal for everyone, but when you start talking about government controls, HIPAA, things like that, that becomes an issue. So from a software standpoint, what do you want to look for? Make sure you have air gap copies, so hopefully they can't get to your data at all, first of all, and change it. Second of all, though, if they do get to your data, make sure it's encrypted. So a low-level copy, a DD from a Linux admin console can't make a copy of your data, and then now all of a sudden they have it and the theft has occurred. If it's encrypted, obviously they can still steal it, but they can't really do anything with it. Make sure that you secure protocols when you're transferring your data around. And then from the other side of it, make sure you lock down your control planes within your backup. Make sure your APIs are locked down. Make sure the passwords and everything else are sufficient as described by probably the backup vendor as to what's strong enough, right? A great way is to get in there as a malicious actor, turn off the backups, delete the backups, and then go after the primary data. So, lock those down. And, multi-factor authentication has become very popular. I'd say it's almost a must-have, especially for backup products and things, working with this valuable data that if they can get a hold of it, there's just so much of it. It can really create a problem for an organization. So I talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to up level a little bit because I see a lot of I've been talking about this for several years now. A lot of the organizations within a larger company, their cybersecurity looks a lot at network perimeter protection, data access protection, endpoint protection, password protections. Those are all really, really important. I'm not saying don't do those. But to me, as a data guy, it's like they're after your data, protecting, get your data. So protect your data on your servers and your storage systems. Make sure your passwords are strong there. And on the backup side, protect that, but then also make sure there are copies there for recovery. So this is one big ball of complete data protection. Everything has got to be in place here, not just the data access. Eventually, in my way of thinking, and a lot of the clients I talk to, they seem to eventually break through. So how do you recover the data? How do you bring it back? How do you get yourself back running in less than 6 or 8 months, which, that can really, really hurt a company depending on what processes they've been able to, and how dependent you are on your electronic systems able to attack. So ransomware attacks, they often, as we were talk about targeting the backup. And so some of the things to watch, make sure you have data protection, air gapping within your backup software. Make sure there's an air gap copy they can't get to. Make sure the controls are in place. If there's a logical air gap that they can't get at that data, remove that data, get after that data. Make sure there's a vertical it's really nice if you have a vertical integration on this complete data protection stack so that you have one dashboard that can see it all, not a dashboard just for network perimeter stuff and then another dashboard for data protection. I think increasingly you're going to see these two things being integrated into a holistic approach to, okay, I have this great perimeter, it's hardened, it's strong, and when they finally do the breakthrough, then I'll be able to stop them at the storage area, and the storage guys are putting a lot of cool software into their storage now to detect it and shut down those attacks quickly. So they're going to be part of this whole thing. And then the backup, being able to detect an attack, detect a sleeping attack, make sure you can clean the data up, and then make sure you can do a recovery quickly, right? So, but you also, that which means you want to also scan your backups for ransomware, do an antivirus check on your files. Before you bring it back, you need to verify the data integrity. And so work with companies that can do that for you and with you, so you can bring it back. Ensure all your data is clean. Protection of your data cannot be overlooked. It's not just about perimeter. So the other thing that I've noticed has kind of happened, and it's been sneaky because these things change slowly and evolve over time. But the way VMware backs up things, the way SAP HANA backs up things, the way Hyper-V document, all these companies, as the requirements for data protection have evolved, so have the mechanisms that you use to get the data or to back up the data here. And make sure you're getting it backed up in what I consider to be an application consistent state. It's a lot easier if you work and have tools to work with the application to create this application consistent state. So your copies are, once you bring them back, they're instantly usable, or pretty much instantly usable, as easily as you can. These things have evolved though. And so, just like you patch your servers, or you should be patching your servers for security, you probably need to look at your backup from time to time and say, am I using the best way to back up VMware? Am I using my best way to back up SAP HANA? Things have changed. Is there a better way to do that now in a way that advances that as well? So, just like patching, look at your backup agents, the way they back up, the processes they use. Is it the latest and greatest and the best way that these apps want you to do it to get this application consistent state? There's a lot to cover as well, right? So, we used to be every kind of just VMware was it, right? Kind of a little bit 10 years ago. But now, you got the VMs, you got the containers, you got bare metal, you have the cloud VMs. There's a lot of different data in a lot of different places. We become much more distributed within our data centers. And so you want software that probably covers all those scenarios in some sense, right? So you don't have to have different softwares doing different things, tools for multiple scenarios, and keep your process up to date. It's really important in your protection, as important as patching your servers. And also when you start thinking about this, the world's evolving for backup. They're getting better. Seek methods to cut out the complexities of backing this up. Things have gotten easier, simpler. Make sure you have multiple scenarios. That goes back to, how do you protect in multiple scenarios? Well, because some of them take backup agents. Other ones you can use their native APIs, like SAP HANA. Some of them are agentless with appliances. There's various ways. You probably want a backup system that will cover all these. At a minimum, you want a backup system that, if you look at your apps, can cover the various scenarios for the apps you want to be able to back up within your organization. And then, make sure you maintain application consistency. It's a lot easier to back up and recover. Really, to recover that way, it's a little bit more difficult to back up that way, but to recover that way, if you make the copies application consistent, that when you bring them back, you'll be okay. And then, make sure your APIs are there to recover in a coherent state. A lot of this stuff is automated anymore. So as things have gotten smarter, as we've moved closer and closer into this world of self-management, aggressively autonomous management for backup, boy, that'd be really great. We're not quite, we're a long ways from that yet, but we are continue to move in that direction, making things easier and easier and easier. One of the things you want to do then is, if all this stuff is automated, all this stuff is happening, what does the administrator look at? Well, you look at backup reporting, and there's a bunch of really important reports to start looking at. Let the backup thing do its own thing. You don't have to be the administrator anymore. But then you still need to keep in tab on everything with the backup reporting. And while a lot of these reports you may not look at on a regular basis or on a daily basis, you might want to look at them on a regular basis and make sure that you have the proper coverage of backups, make sure your backups are running. Being autonomous, or kind of as it starts to self-manage itself, That doesn't mean you can just leave it alone and never look at it again, right? So reporting becomes a lot more important. Reporting also can be a real administrative time consuming thing. So, make sure your backups, they have to be comprehensive, but we also have shorthanded IT staffs. So your administrators need to be able to, monitor this thing and kind of optimize this thing as it goes on to start doing its own things within its backup software. Um, Scale becomes really important too. So, keep an eye if you're a major enterprise with a lot of different functionality. Scale is really important. When you start talking about tens of thousands of session instances within your backup reporting, how do you find the one that's important to you? How do you get alerted to the ones that are important? Thousands, if not tens of thousands, that's that scale problem. It's like, how does a person sort through all this stuff, And so the backups themselves, kind of, when you look at a vendor, browse through them, look for reporting that makes sense, is streamlined, is easy to go through, and it's supporting kind of a layer on top of the automation doing the work for you increasingly in the future, hopefully, especially when AI comes around. So as I look at AI, and I look at AI for backup, and I got to have a slide about AI because everyone does. But if so one of the other surveys we did is, just asking them, what are some of the shortcomings of kind of your data center and your backups, and a lot of it was around, staff skills shortages. It's continuing to be a problem. A lot of people say even if we want to hire the people, which many times we're trying to reduce staff in this area, because backup isn't usually considered a strategic element, but it's like a really important insurance plan. So it's not something that, they're trying to invest in their applications and in furthering their business and in digital transformation. Not, they don't see backup as so. This staffing skills shortage is really important to try to attack. There's a lot of things that can be done within backups and have been to drive operational efficiency, as well as kind of you can start to do, those reportings were kind of canned as I talked about all those different, there were 10 different reports or so there. But you could also, using AI, start talking about semi-custom reporting, right? And that, you can maybe create your own report with the AI. And guiding users with alert response is going to be that, that's the easy ones, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that AI to me is going to be like spell check for a writer or maybe Copilot for writing, in that you're still going to have to write it. You're still going to have to think. You're still going to have to be involved, most likely, but it's going to get easier and easier, more automated. Also, AI makes the decisions for you. You still need a whole bunch of automation to actually carry out those decisions, right? You need the application around the AI, the backup application, and it's got to evolve along with the AI. But there's still some really cool things that I can see coming down the road in the way of assistance by AI and ML even around, intelligent scheduling of backups, early detection of ransomware. There's a lot of cool stuff going on there. You can start looking at the data, looking at data patterns, along with deep threat analysis, misconfigurations. So I talked about locking down your control plane. The problem is if you don't know what to look for in the lockdown, it's hard to figure out how to check to make sure it's been locked down, right? So, actually having an AI application that can look at this and say, did you really want to have this setting this way? That does let people in. You changed it for a reason. You want to change it back. You wanted to do this migration, this copy, this recover, whatever it was, you changed that, or maybe the application is brought offline, upgraded, you want to bring it back, and whatever that misconfiguration is. And backup has tentacles all over your data center, right? Because it's got the workloads and applications spread all over your data center and all over the cloud and all over edge. And so there's a lot of tentacles out there allowing for a lot of possibility of misconfiguration. AI would be great at finding those, right? So I definitely can see that kind of thing happening. helping to remove malware, things like that. Finding copies that are no longer needed is really important. I talked about data theft. Make sure you don't, the data theft can't happen. Classify, being able to, find unclassified or improper controls. I guess the last one is, this natural language processing for troubleshooting. That goes back to, how do we guide the users through a better alert process when your system's been attacked by ransomware and you need to bring the images back? That's not the best time to pull out the user guide and try to figure out how you're going to do that, right? Well, people are people. But, if they can help you start very quickly with a response that can respond and shut down that attack, get that data back quickly, that would be a huge advantage that AI can provide us, right, to the organization. So it's not that AI is going to take over backup or AI is going to be backup, but it's got all these cool little things that are going to evolve in the industry as the automation also has to evolve around the AI decision making. But the industry is eager to move in this direction, and they already have been with a lot of automation. No presentation anymore is complete without talking about multi-cloud. Almost all using organizations anymore seem to have some presence on premise and some premise in the cloud. You can see from our survey, which IT domain possesses the greatest challenge for security visibility. Public cloud is a huge one. Protecting the data, your data and your inside your public cloud and your workloads, as well as both AI, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, Salesforce, all your email accounts, 365, all those have to be protected. Typically, all the cloud models have some kind of shared kind of responsibility model between the cloud infrastructure and the user of the cloud, that they have to be involved in that as well, setting the controls, understanding the backup. Cloud has gotten a lot better in their backup capabilities, but there's still a lot of shortcomings in the cloud backups relative to what I see on premise today. And a lot of the snapshotting and a lot of the native applications aren't there. And some of them, Azure and others have, and even Microsoft and even Amazon, is up their game around backups, but they're still a bit behind, especially in some of the real-time protections around ransomware and things like that. So you might want to work with a vendor that can actually run the backup on the cloud as well as on-prem. That way you have the same functionality both places. That's kind of super and cool. And then, really make sure that you've addressed these public cloud challenges around, the data silos. Each application has its own mechanisms, integration challenges, coordination backups. There's a lot to do around backup, and clouds do really well at creating the VMs and infrastructure, not as well, as far as I can tell, doing the backups themselves with their own mechanisms. So, and then, when you start thinking about this, okay, how are you going to cover your data at the edge, in containers, on VMs, in the cloud, on premise? You really need to think about a backup application that can centralize your backups, be able to have kind of one interface that you can kind of use, and not even the interface as much as the workflows, the mechanisms. Go back to that skill shortage. You don't want to have one admin for cloud, one admin for on-premise, because they work all differently, right? Even if they're the same application, they really shouldn't work all differently. And you can also consider cloud to be a partner in providing a recovery site for your backups as well. I'm going to talk a little more about this, but you want to be able to move your media and your backup servers around, be able to have them run in different places. You want to make sure you can sync data very easily. And you also want to make sure you can kind of redirect and, create, move your recovery to what I could call here compatible platforms. but be able to relocate your media and be able to provide media migration capabilities. One big word that just kind of sums this all up to me is compatibility and flexibility. You don't know exactly where you're going to need to go in the future on this hybrid world. But if you pick vendors that have a media that's movable, easily relocatable, flexible, and easy to use, that's really important in support of this. So let's see some of the top initiatives. So the top initiatives for developing infrastructures in 2022. You can see deploying hybrid cloud is large. Now, I will say, when I talk to people about hybrid cloud, and people that maybe even answered this survey, I hear a lot of them talk about hybrid cloud as a migration. In the future, hybrid cloud isn't going to be a migration. Hybrid cloud is going to be like breathing. You're going to breathe some workloads into the cloud. You're going to breathe out other workloads, breathe out, and other workloads are going to move on premise. And there's a lot of repatriation right now going on, moving app workloads from the cloud to on premise. And so there's a lot of this movement going around back and forth all over the place. Flexibility, you said, again, is really important. Be able to optimize your retention through placement. Where do you want, so companies now are taking a workload, they look at the workload and they go, where's it best to run this? Bare metal, VM, container, cloud, software, edge, on-premise. Where do I want to run this? Where's it best? And certain applications, and I won't go through this, it's a whole nother presentation, but certain applications you're going to want to run on premise and others not. It depends on the life cycle of the application and workload and how things are going. But at the end of the day, things are moving around, and placement is really important. Also to consider when you're talking about backup, and I'm going to talk a little more about this, but consider the blast radius for DR. If your data center happens to have a big networking issue, do you have another data center you can go to, a second site you can start running from and recover that data to and get going? So what to look for, the ISVs have done a lot in this area, the backup people, make sure that you cover all your bases, make sure that you can support the targets you need to support. Different targets have different capabilities, whether that be Scality, Cloudarian for on-premise, Alibaba Cloud, Google Cloud, AWS S3 as backup targets, Microsoft Blob Azure backup targets for backups. Where do you want to place those backups? And, having a nice list there is important. Obviously, the list doesn't have to be extensive, but it needs to cover the ones you need, and what you want to use, right? And make sure you have capabilities to sync and resync from the cloud. And I talked about this flexibility in media, being able to move it anywhere and run it anywhere becomes really handy. It's kind of like the agility of the cloud. It doesn't sound like much, but when you start messing with it, it becomes a really important element. Just like being able to move and run media anywhere becomes an important element to hybrid cloud. So cloud-based backups, this whole idea of 3, 2, 1, 3 copies, 2 media types, 1 offsite is still as relevant today as it has been when it was invented. Gee, I don't know when, many years ago. So I'm suggesting that in the new era, you want to keep a performance copy on site. Performance copy, it partly is to make sure you can make your backup within the backup window, but probably more importantly, a performance copy to do a quick recovery so you don't have to do a whole bunch of copies back and things like that. And then keep a secure copy somewhere as well, possibly on premise. Make sure it's locked down, make sure it's versioned, make sure it's air gapped, make sure that it's fail safe so that no attack can ever get to your data within that thing. And also then, go back, I talked about some of the hygiene things, make sure that the secure copies have the proper ransomware hygiene, put into them too. And make a remote copy. You don't have to do it this way. There's a lot of versions of 321. I have kind of a secure copy, a remote copy coming off a secure copy. There's a lot of different ways you can get there. But you also want to have something out of that side, that blast radius of the on-premise or the on the cloud. How do you move it into somewhere where, again, it's protected and it's outside that blast radius, that offsite? And so CloudWorks really great for being one of these copies, right? Because it's outside the blast radius. It's very easy to make the copies to sync them over there. It's easy to run them back there. You can bring them back anywhere you want to within the primary storage. You don't necessarily have to bring them back and run them on the primary storage that you started with. You can bring up another server and bring them back to that. A lot of flexibility in this model of 321 and how I'm doing this architecture here. So always make sure you have up-to-date kind of continuous copies. I mean, it's okay if you want to do backup once a day, as long as you were willing to lose a day's worth of data. But increasingly, that isn't an acceptable thing. And, people are doing largely almost continuous copies so that the least amount of data is lost, if none, potentially is lost. Important to make sure that the cadence of those performance copies are as tight as possible. Make sure it's an automated process. Obviously, you can't, sit around watching this or running this. Make sure you have a choice of backup options. That can be really important for the cloud, and bringing things back from the cloud and bringing this recovery back more quickly than 6 or 8 months from when you had the ransomware attack hit you. Consider the amount of control, desired. Some admins are expert admins that can do these recoveries in their sleep. There's others that they need to be kind of walked through it. It's okay to have either one. Make sure you have the softwares and capabilities to do those, though. And consider how archiving fits in. I haven't talked a lot about archiving, but archiving is an important aspect of this as well. So what to watch for, make sure that these cloud data syncs can be done on a regular basis. Make sure one of the Achilles heels to go into the cloud is make sure there's enough internet bandwidth to get the continuous copies you need, and make sure your copies can go over that bandwidth. I'm always surprised talking to clients as to they have a lot of bandwidth, but maybe it's the bandwidth that they've actually segmented out and used for the internet is really small because they don't want people web browsing. Well, that's also the same bandwidth possibly you're doing for backup. So make sure your company not only has enough bandwidth, make sure you have enough dedicated bandwidth to the process itself, and work with your network providers to do that. Not only out of your facility, but across the network to the cloud. It's best to have S3 object compliance. Almost everyone has that anymore, but if they don't, that's really important. S3 seems to become the standard for cloud target backups. Choice of backup targets. I also haven't talked a lot about, but also consider data sovereignty in your requirements. When you start moving things off site, that becomes more and more important. Small organizations seem to have less trouble with this, but larger organizations where you have backups in data centers all around the world, this can be a big concern as well. So obviously you need to set up your backups with that in mind, and all the sovereignty rules and things. So I talked a lot about backups that continually are evolving to get better and better at managing themselves. But another way to go about this that's become really popular is just really hiring it out as backup as a service. Carbonite I just threw out here. There's tons of them, but I just threw out there as one that's a big name that provides this kind of professional support. And within the cloud itself, within a cloud mechanism, they provide all the UI portal, all the backup control, all your abilities. And it's really great, especially since our data is living everywhere now. So, how do this works really well if there's a cloud then, and kind of agents all over in all these different areas, little hooks in all these different areas to bring your data into the cloud, and it can be even like an S3 AWS service that it sends the data to. And then this is the control backup as a service. This tends to be the control mechanism, the master mechanism, coordinating, automating, making sure there's a single portal, making sure this is all going on. This can also free up those those resources so that they don't have to be doing backup administration. You can offload it to others to do other kinds of data innovations. It also tends to eliminate some capex. Backup many times, if you buy the backup targets, you buy the backup softwares, you maybe pay for those once a year, maybe, but it kind of frees up your budget and really creates a pay-as-you-go kinds of service, which some find really interesting and important for their business organizations. These experts can also potentially improve security, and they can improve reliability, especially for smaller organizations that don't have the strong skill sets you might need to protect some of these different areas. So, look for established services, backup, service vendors. They need to have, professional support. They need to, consider them kind of being a partner in supplying your data protection. And, all the things I talked about around the security, the control, that's all really important for this kind of functionality as well. So kind of wrap this whole thing up. We've talked a lot about a lot of different things. There's so much more in the backup world going on beyond this. But these to me were the most important things going on, right now at this time. But, enterprises are storing in more and more diverse locations. The flexibility of the backup is increasingly becoming important. You also want to make sure that you, focus on ransomware recovery and figure out the backup mechanisms you need to do a good recovery. So instead of, thinking about backup as a copy that is an insurance plan you could possibly use down the road, think of it as, I got to possibly recover this sometime in the future. What kinds of copies, what kinds of backup, who's my app, who do I want to use to supply this recovery? And then, backfill into the copies, backfill into the management and everything else. Excuse me. So, backup solutions, as I talked about, they're also becoming a lot more self-managing, and they also are being distributed. So, make sure that you can kind of the backup vendors you're using and you're moving to, and the mechanisms and methods you're using to back up within these environments are kind of compatible. I don't know why you wouldn't want to kind of use the same processes, the same workflows, the same mindset on premise as you do in the cloud. And you probably want to, start really thinking about, how can I consolidate the processes so that they're all kind of the same for me, so I know where I'm going, what I'm doing, because I've done it and it's the same way for everything I'm doing. And whether that be VMs, whether that be cloud VMs, whether that be VMware VMs, whether that be containers, whether that be edge, you name it. Probably it's best, it's nice to have kind of best of breed, but if you have a different backup application for everything you're doing because you're going best of breed, that's probably not going to be good. It's probably not going to work out well for you. So, try to consolidate process, try to do things all the same way, and look for vendors that are working on that seamlessly. It goes without, saying, we already talked about this, you have to have guaranteed fail-safe data protection. If your data isn't, why are you even collecting your data if you're not going to protect it? Don't even bother storing it if you're not going to protect it. Anymore, all data has to be protected everywhere, in all places. I see people not protect their remote worker data. Okay, but and then they run into problems when they try to have to bring it back, or when it's been attacked. It's like, well, it's going to be attacked eventually. Why even bother storing it? Obviously you need to support remote workers, but come on. And make sure that your backups and your recovery mechanisms are undefeatable. You got to be able to count on them. I talked about, you might even have a plan B here. I didn't talk a lot about data governance, but that can be really important for firms. Data sovereignty regulations can be really important. I think that'll become increasingly so, not less so, that the countries are going to insist that your data stay within their borders, and you're going to have mechanisms for that. Backup obviously likes to create a single site that consolidates things, so it kind of runs counter to backup sovereignty issues. So you have to consider those as you figure out where your backup targets are, and how you're going to recover your data and where your data is going to live. Comprehensive reporting and monitoring and deep insight is going to become increasingly important, because that's the mechanism you use to watch the automation, to watch the backups as they continue to evolve, as they continue to add AI to them. They're going to get smarter and smarter and be able to do things for you that you have to do today, but you're still going to want to keep an eye on it, right? And you still need to optimize it, and you still need to monitor it. You don't get out of that just because there's really great automation underneath you and orchestration. And that's the last one here. It's like, these backups, sample and look at the backup vendors you're using, and just every once in a while go, is this giving me the best overall process efficiency? Have they continued to evolve their softwares towards better automation, better orchestration? If I pick a different vendor, in the long run, can I do more with less? And you saw the skill set problem. That's real. That's what people are dealing with. So, consider that, I guess, in your tools and in what you're doing. So this was Dennis Hahn. I'm going to look at some of the questions here now and take some of those.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for sharing that wealth of information there. A lot of great stuff. We have now come to our question and answer portion of our agenda. So just a reminder to participate in our Q&A. Just type in your question into the text box that is located either below the presentation window, and then you click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, or it should be open on your left side. If we are not able to answer all the submitted questions during our webinar, we'll be sure to make sure that we follow up, speakers to follow up with you, and they can reply to you offline. Questions have been coming in, so we appreciate that. Keep them coming. Dennis, let's start off. The first one is, why do I need to keep updating my backup to support new versions of app backups processes?
So, VMware, Hyper-V, they've established their processors, the way that you get your hooks into them to create your backups. Several years ago, many years ago, things have changed. Failure mechanisms are better understood. They've evolved their environments to do different kinds of migration and things like that. And then you've had ransomware come in and hit them. So they've changed the way, and they continue to change the way that they support backups. They usually support the legacy as well, so it probably doesn't break your current backup. But if you want the latest and greatest and the best way to probably recover, you want to make sure you upgrade to the latest mechanisms that VMware is providing, Documentum is providing, ransomware is providing, SAP HANA is providing. You need to keep evolving those mechanisms, because those mechanisms, they evolve. The reason they did that, the reason they evolved those mechanisms is because they have better ideas within those app organizations, and the hooks into those apps are really important. You just don't want to take a copy of your data. You want to take a usable, recoverable copy of your data. And so those hooks evolve. And I said, just like patching a server, where you have to make sure that you have your patches up to date to protect against all the security, they still work if you don't patch them, right? They still work just fine. But you have all these vulnerabilities and you're opening yourself up to problems. It's the same thing with backup. It's like you want to make sure that your agents, your mechanisms, your hooks into these applications keep up with the latest and greatest, because they're coming up with great new ideas, and especially around the recovery side more than even the copy side. So how do you more efficiently recover? How do you more efficiently bring them back? The other thing is they're continually evolving so that you can kind of start to create one mechanism or one approach for recovery. And so they used to kind of be isolated, and it's like SAP came up with their own theirs was the best. VMware came up there, but they're starting to consolidate as they've been evolving and adding. So, hopefully you can get close to being able to provide the same recovery process for all your applications, as even though each one has different hooks into it with different APIs. For the user admin, they can actually recover kind of using the same approach, which is really important. It's not like you do a recovery. Hopefully you're not doing a recovery once a week, and unless you're practicing, that should be great. But you're not doing recovery all that often, so it's really important to make sure you have a streamlined kind of process that hopefully is the same for all your applications or similar. And that helps, especially now, because a lot of them have changed to be able to do that, or allow the backup vendor to do that for you.
Great. Thank you, Dennis. You were just mentioning recovery. The next question is, well, what about that recovery strategy? Knowing which application and data must be in place initially, and then knowing the time frame that you're talking about. Can you address that?
Yeah, so in past webinars, I've done a lot around recovery, and that, a lot of recoveries, you probably need to really have a strategy for which applications do you want to bring back first, which applications are critical and crucial, how quickly can you bring those back. If you have an e-commerce site, you want to be able to bring that back in minutes. Maybe the remote workers can take a day. So you need to prioritize these things. You might need to have different mechanisms. But when you start thinking about RPO and RTO, is typically comes into play here. Recovery point objective, recovery time objective. How quickly you want to bring it back, and how much data are you kind of willing to kind of go without, which is getting less and less. When you start thinking about those, that drives. If you start at that point and drive backwards, then you start looking at the copy mechanisms and go, I need this kind of copy. I need them to be placed this way. I need them in these different areas remotely. I need to, and push all the way back to the copy, the vendor, and the basics of backup. And so there's a lot involved in that recovery. Like I said, typically a lot of the newer models, you'll do a recovery into some kind of sandbox, so that you don't reinfect everyone else if the image you're coming back has an issue. There's a lot of intelligence, a lot of automation around helping you try to find the image you want to bring back that is unaffected by ransomware and that is the most up-to-date you can get. So there's a lot of other mechanisms around recovery that you really need to consider. There's some white papers out there. I've written one you can look at. But yes, you definitely need a backup strategy, and that should probably be the first thing you do, based around RTO and RPO, which are kind of technical terms, but basically I don't want to lose any data, and I want to be able to get it back as fast as I can, and then figure out which applications are most important to you, and start from that kind of strategy and move backwards into what you actually need to back up, how you need to back it up, when you need to back it up, blah, 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 those kinds of things.
All right, thank you. The next question is talking about the automation of backups. So the question is, what access controls are necessary for the management of operations for safe and effective management of those tools and applications that are required?
So all the backups I know of typically have some centralized API. That API really controls the whole environment. That environment is, might be made up of agents, native backups, serverless, agentless backups, appliance-based backups. The API, everything is kind of done through an API. That API, needs to have the typical security things you would think of in there embedded into it. If you look at like REST interfaces and what kinds of things are put into a REST interface or an older version of a SOAP interface. REST interfaces are basically the API kinds of calls that go across the internet or across a network to control, remote mechanisms. The thing is, as an administrator, you don't really need to know a lot about any of that, nor even necessarily those access controls at that level. That's really what the ISV or the backup vendor supplies. So the controls you kind of need are at the higher level around, being able to have good cybersecurity controls for your admin passwords to so that when you so that you can when you click a button or something like that and it sends out these API calls, um, they're secured. You also need multi-factor authentication, of course, and you really need that because what you're going to be interacting with is the dashboard, right? So you want to be able to control your access in and out of that dashboard and the control mechanisms within it that go to the control plane, that go to the APIs. And so, strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, kind of the usual culprits, as well as, one of the reports should really be around, who has access, how do they have access, limit access to only the backup admins, not the admin world. And, in those reports, monitor who's been accessing, how often they've been accessing, and, go and look at those reports every once in a while and go, hey, why in the heck is this person coming into the backup console? I have no idea what they'd be doing in there, right? That'd be a big red flag. So, it's those kinds of things. They're kind of the general securing an application kind of things we expect to see, because at the end of the day, that's how you're coming into the backup application as an admin.
All right, great. I think we have time for one more question. So what about data backup synchronization between different applications that are located both on premises and then in the cloud?
Yeah, so you should have a strategy, you should have a design. They need to use secure communication mechanisms. You have to make sure you have adequate bandwidth, as we talked about. Different companies have different sync mechanisms. The sync mechanisms vary broadly, or the sync mechanism basically being the copy replication mechanism. And as I kind of talked about during the presentation, 5 years ago when I was talking about hybrid cloud or these sync mechanisms, I would it was more about migration. It was a one-time migration. You're going to move this workload out to the cloud, and you assumed you're going to leave it there forever. And that really hasn't been the case for most companies when we're doing the surveys. There's a tremendous amount of companies moving back and forth. That means you need to have planned mechanisms in place, not just do an FTP of your data over to some remote cloud site or something, and so lots of times you'll have an application or a smaller stripped down application running in the cloud that can talk to the on-premise, and it's a design sync between the two mechanisms. Unfortunately, typically, from what I see still, most of them are one company kinds of mechanisms for sync. So if you want to sync this type of data, this type of application, you typically have to kind of consider that on both ends. That's not completely true because some of them sync directly into an S3. So then they don't have to have the exact same application on both ends, but S3 needs to support the way that you're moving the data to and out of S3, or in the case of Azure Blob, or you name it, they all kind of work in a similar fashion with similar security controls that you need to ensure. When you look at most of the clouds, Azure, AWS S3, Google Cloud, the actual copy mechanisms across a REST interface or I forget what REST stands for, and I use the word so often, representational, some kind of transfer. But the copy mechanism itself for the data is probably similar for all of those. They're real close in the way you compose the API and the way you kind of upload the data or download the data. But the security mechanisms are kind of all different. So you really need to be careful working with a vendor that supports that target environment, that they support the security mechanisms for AWS Blob, for instance, versus S3 Blob, because they tend to be a little bit different on how they do the security layers of that. But make sure those are in place, make sure you're using them. Cloud, unfortunately, lets you and your application kind of sidestep it and make it easier for themselves, it's like, don't do that. You know, if you, from work with your ISV vendor, your backup vendor, and make sure that that they're using the most secure mechanisms within those APIs to create the secure transfers you need. Don't let them get off easy and use some of the shortcuts the cloud allows you to use to make it easier for you and them, because they also aren't nearly as secure. And there's a lot, when you look at the APIs, you look at the REST interfaces, there's a lot of shortcuts that are used there. Don't do that. So work with your ISV, make sure those transfers are really secure, and make sure that they can be long-lived and in place and there when you need them, as opposed to bringing them up just for a migration and then tearing them down and then having to rebuild the whole thing again. That's not the way the future is going to be. It's worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future.
Thank you, Dennis. Some excellent advice there. I do want to thank everyone for participating on today's webinar and for submitting your questions and comments. We truly appreciate that. I also want to thank our presenter, Dennis Hahn, for sharing his expertise with us, and a special thank you to OpenText for sponsoring this session today. Now, an archived version of this webinar will be made available shortly. Feel free to come back, view this session again, or even share it with your colleagues. And you can do that by using that same audience link that we sent you earlier. And again, a short survey is going to appear at the conclusion of this webinar, so please take a few moments to fill that out. We'd love to get your feedback. And again, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.